in its 23rd year and following our tradition aims at building a body of learned discussion that is Catholic both in its breadth of research and in its dialogue with contemporary Catholic Christian thought. And now I invite our president, Father Charles Sikorsky, to open us in prayer. Father Charles.
Thank you, Steve. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this great liturgical season of Easter, where we remember and celebrate the resurrection of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, from death. We thank you for this great season to experience the graces of new life, the graces of hope, the grace of knowing that we can always trust that your power is greater than the cross, is greater than death itself. So many times in life, things are difficult. We suffer. There's so many suffering people in the world. Your Son took all those things away and gave them new meaning with death on the cross, and most of all in his triumph. Help us to always remember that in the midst of every cross, every sacrifice, every suffering and disappointment of Good Friday comes the joy, the new life, and the love of Easter. Help us to celebrate this season with open hearts, close to you, with great hope and great joy. We want to pray for all those now who don't see that light, who are suffering in many different ways today in our world. We pray for an outpouring of peace, of love, of unity in our world today, in our church as well. I want to thank you as well for tonight's talk and speaker. We're going to talk about the truth, the good, the truly good and the beautiful today. We expect tonight in such a way. We thank you, and we put this presentation to see how you are reflected in beauty and art, and that inspires us to think about you and the wonders of your creation. Pray for Dr. Vitz as he continues and is ready, preparing for retirement. We thank you for all the years of his service and love of our students and our schools. And we pray that your Holy Spirit will guide him tonight so we all can be edified and pointed toward the goodness, the truth, and the beauty of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Now please welcome Dr. William Nordland, who will introduce our speaker.
It's a great privilege for me to introduce my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Paul Vitz, as he completes this year's Newman lecture series with the presentation on psychology and visual art, modernist painting, and postmodern art and the recovery of beauty. Paul Vitz is one of the founding fathers of the Institute for Psychological Sciences and of its becoming Divine Mercy University. He has been with IPS DMU since its inception in 1999 and actually taught the very first course offered by the IPS. In his 24 years career with DMU, he has made essential contributions to the intellectual foundation and mission of the university. Dr. Vitz is co-editor and co-author of a groundbreaking book, A Catholic Christian Metamodel of the Person, Integration with Psychology and Mental Health Practice, which won an International Expanded Reason Award in 2020 from the Vatican Foundation for its expansion of the relationship of faith, science, and psychology. Dr. Vitz is also Professor Emeritus of Psychology at New York University, where he taught for over 3 decades prior to joining DMU. At DMU, he made important contributions in experimental psychology, cognitive psychology, and more broadly began his scholarship critiquing modern psychology. His influential book, Psychology as Religion, The Cult of Self-Worship, was a sobering call to psychology to recognize its limits and its needs to make a place in psychology for transcendence and truth instead of reductionism and relativism. Generally, an introduction would stop now. We could move on to the presentation. However, this would leave the audience not truly introduced to our speaker. There are at least three extraordinary things contained in the previous comments that are implicit, but in justice should be made explicit in order for you to understand what a remarkable gift Dr. Paul Vitz is. First, it's been mentioned that Dr. Paul Vitz is a professor emeritus of psychology at New York University. In academia, this status is only awarded very selectively to faculty members who have given a lifetime of service to their institutions and made significant scholarly contributions. This means that in 1999, when Dr. Vitz learned about the project to create IPS, now DMU, he was already a well-respected scholar in his mid-60s with tenure at a very prestigious university. Yet he heard the call of God and joined an effort to found a new university from scratch. This was an act of faith, hope, and charity. Second, most scholars have a very small intellectual playground. They have a narrow area of specialization, which they focus on almost exclusively throughout their careers. However, if we extend this metaphor of intellectual playground to Professor Vitz, we would have to say his life work was the size, scope, and diversity of an intellectual amusement park. One close to the size of Disney World. Experimental psychology, cognitive psychology, personality theory, research on serial killers, a comprehensive analysis of a Christian view of the person, and tonight for us, art and beauty are but a selective listing of the areas of inquiry that have captured his creative and curious mind. Finally, it's easy to look at the remarkable big picture achievements of our presenters and to lose sight of the micro level of day in, day out actions that reveal his character as a person. Through over 1,000 lectures carefully prepared, hundreds of meetings patiently mentoring students on their dissertations, through your regular meetings and collaborations with your colleagues, through your frequent expressions of friendship, concern, and encouragement, you have, Dr. Vitz, helped your students and colleagues grow in knowledge, wisdom, and character. For this, we thank you. But more importantly, for your exemplary modeling of generosity, sacrifice, and self-giving. You have helped your students and colleagues become better Christians and helped DMU to more vibrantly live out its Christian mission. For this, we are eternally grateful. I now entrust you to our speaker, Dr. Paul Vitz.
Wow. And after that, I have nothing I can say. Thank you, Bill. Well, this evening I'm presenting material that I've never presented before. So some of the edges may seem a little rough. But we have a question and answer period where we can smooth things out, I believe. In addition, we'll be talking mostly about painting and about images. And so I think you will find it interesting. Paintings and images are interesting, sort of intrinsically. It's not just a word lecture. And so, not only interesting, I hope that with every now and then we'll also find it just plain fun. So we are now going to go and look at slide 1. There. Not so pretty, of course, but here we see we're going to start with what it does take to make an image with a little bit of a look at children's developmental art. And we're going to assume that children start, and there's a lot of evidence to this effect, they start art with what I call stage 1, the scribble stage. examples here. Next slide. On the left, we have a list of the kind of basic scribbles that children show, developed by a woman named Kellogg, who was very deeply involved in the study of children's art. So we see here a group of the basic scribbles that start the beginning of an image. And I call this the basic scribble stage level 1 or stage 1. Over here, we see that after stage 1, which is shown here as number 1, you'll begin to see at the beginning of what I call stage 2 in the development of an image. And that I call basically very simple patterns, simple geometric patterns, okay? We see them here, square there, so we can all see them. The third stage, which comes after geometric patterns, is what I call schematic images. Schematic images are short forms of an image of something that you can recognize. In other words, they are schematic objects. And we assume that's a face. That's the beginning of stage 3 in the making of an image. There's some more stage 3 getting more complex in terms of a schematic object. Here you see that the face is getting legs. So we're starting to move toward what is obviously at the highest level, still the schematic representation of an object, in this case, the person. So that's level 3. Level 1 again, basic scribbles. Level 2, geometric patterns. Level 3, schematic objects. Level 4 is going to be 3D dimensional, okay? Next slide.
And Dr. Vitz, let me just invite you, if you have a row number, like 5 or 6, when you're talking about the levels, if you can name that for our online viewers.
Oh, okay. We'll try.
Thank you.
Next slide.
We're ready for the next slide.
Here are some more detailed examples of the schematic level. Very early schema, you can tell that's supposed to be the face of a person and presumably legs or possibly arms and so forth. And down at the bottom, whoops. We see a higher level schematic object of a person. See a girl with dresses, a dog, and so forth. Almost all human beings, when they go through this development of how to draw an image or make an image, they all go through at least a stage 3, that is to the schematic objects. And that's where your stick figures and so forth would occur. The last stage, stage 4, which is 3D realism, is only found in a few very talented young people, and is not normally what we all learn how to master. Next. So here are the stages. Can we get this off of there?
Working on it. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stage 1, basic scribbles. Stage 2, geometric patterns. Stage 3, schematic objects. Stage 4, 3D realism. And I put another stage in here, level 0 or stage 0. And this is a plain surface to draw on. It's really not the image, but it's the surface on which you're going to begin to make an image. Plain piece of paper, or plain piece of canvas, or whatever. I call that stage or level 0. Okay, let's go. And these are the levels that a child will go through up to schematic objects. And almost all of us can do at least a schematic object image drawing right now. I can tell that degree of talent is present in me.
Next slide, please.
What we have here is we're now moving from the normal development of drawing as it occurs with children. Now what we're going to look at are drawings made by patients who were either getting more and more depressed, more and more pathological, or in a few cases, we'll see where patients were getting better and better, where they were recovering. And these are drawings by them. And what we see here is a woman, this is her first drawing, and it's a pretty high level stage 3. It's sort of schematic, but it's pretty high level development. There's a little hint of depth in the hair and so forth. We move over here, and the second object of the image. Here we see that she has begun to regress. And so what we're looking at here is a kind of measure of the increase in pathology in a person by looking at the way in which they go back down the stages that would normally be present in development. So she's at the stage 3, high level, pretty level here. She's now, that's very schematic. She's more pathological here. And at the last stage, when the last drawing was made, she was even more severely pathological. And here we see that we're down to, well, a fair number of basic scribbles. We see a simple geometric here. We're not quite sure what that might mean. And here we see a schematic object. So she's moved down the hierarchy that normally a child moves up. Okay, next slide. Here's another, this was an artist. We've lost some of the detail here, but this is when he was not especially disturbed. And these are rather realistic. There's some of the detail is gone. It shows the 3-dimensionality of these. But I think you can see that these are more realistic. They would be really, I would call them low level stage 4. Realistic. But as his depression increased and his pathology increased, we have a drawing like this. At this point, we're out of stage 4 altogether. We're into schematic entirely. And then when this is 2 years later, he's now almost entirely, well, that I guess there may be a hint of a face there. I don't know, a hint of the schematic. Most of it is this kind of thing you find at level 2 with geometric shapes and possibly some scribbles. So we see again regression in the expression of this person's increased pathology. In a way, these could also almost be used as measures of which way of the degree of pathology of a person in terms of the extent to which they regress down the schematic representation of an image. Next. Here's the patient who got better. There's his first one. I'd say that's hardly, I don't know that you would even say that's a schematic face. You might, but it's certainly filled with some geometric patterns and scribbles. Here we have clearly you do have a face here. We're up to very low levels, level 3, very low level. Here we're at a little higher level of schematic. And finally, at the last drawing by this man, he's part of level 4 is showing up there. He's beginning to get a little bit of depth along with the realism. So he has both the schematic at the high level and some real depth and realism at the 4th level. So it's a mix of those 2 levels, but it's very clear that you can see as this person goes up the stages that they're obviously getting better. Next. This patient was a young woman who was brought into sort of emergency hospital in New York, and she was completely, I don't know whether that's quite the expression, completely gone. She was on drugs. And this is the first thing she drew when she came in. It's entirely basic scribbles. And this young woman stayed there until late the next day. And she drew around noon of the first day she was in there. She drew this. And here we see schematics. It's a big improvement from here. She's recovering from her drug exposure. And so in fact, by the time she gets to this drawing, She's at 3D realism. She's at stage 4, and she was released. So this was a very quick, positive response due to a serious drug overdose problem. In other words, she was not mentally disturbed in that sense. It was just the effect of the drug. But you can see it was very powerful in terms of the original drawing. Next. Here's another patient. This is one who came in the same clinic. One of my students was giving them the pieces of paper for the patients to draw on. Here's the first one when he came in. That's a clear schematic level 3 of a person. We come to this one, and although we can see some squares and some geometric pattern, there are no schematic objects that are recognizable here. So he's dropped from schematic level 3. He's dropped down to level 2 completely here. And this one, the only geometric that's left is this one little section here in the middle, and the rest of it looks all like basic scribbles. And this patient was then, it was shortly after this one, which was about 3 days later, he was submitted to long-term psychiatric care. But what I'm trying to point out here is that, again, movement up and down the stages of creating an image is a very interesting notion to keep in mind. Next. Oh, big change. What I'm now going to be talking about is technically called modernist art. It's what most people think of when they think of the term modern art, but it isn't. Modernist art is that trajectory in the history of painting that ended up with abstract art, and we'll see where it finally ends up as well. And that we'll call modernist art. All right? All art in the modern period is not the same by any means. So this trajectory that we're looking at is that very fascinating one that led to the development of abstract art and so forth. And what I'm going to be arguing here is that these artists are going to go down that hierarchy as though they're pathological. But they're not. None of them were, as far as I know, at all ill in any particular mental sense at all. But what I would like to propose is this, is that the hierarchy that you can come up and under pathology you can go back down on, that hierarchy is available for any one of us to investigate as long as we can regress in the service of the ego. And here, let me explain what I mean by this. Regression means that you can go back to earlier periods of your own life, memories, experiences, and so on. You can go to some degree to earlier time periods. But in the service of the ego means you can bring what you regress to, you can bring it back up and deal with it with your artistic talent, your artistic knowledge, and so forth. The problem with our mentally disturbed patients that we were looking at is they couldn't come back voluntarily. Most of them, they just regressed, but couldn't come back because the ego wasn't strong enough. They were still trapped down there. A few people, such as some of the flicky ones who I showed, like that one young lady, they weren't so badly regressed by the drugs that except they couldn't come back in a few days and recover natural abilities to draw. But what I'm going to therefore argue is that the creativity of the modernist movement was regression in the service of the artist's ego that can come back up. And then second, I'm arguing that they're going to regress historically, on average, historically, modernism is going to start at level 4, or at realism, lose depth and move to conceptual objects, lose even reference to objects and move to geometric patterns, and then move from geometric patterns to something that we'll call basic scribbles. That was called abstract expressionism when it was a painted video. We'll even get down to level 0. Okay, next. Oh, well, I didn't mention this is sometimes Manet, French painter, is sometimes considered the first person to show the hint of modernist movement. And what he did, whoops, we'll go back one. In this portrait, he had made the first little movement from three-dimensional realism, level 4 at the highest. He had begun to move toward flattening of the picture plane. That is the loss of depth. And that's the hint that then will allow basically the artist to go even further in their regression. And he's lost some of the depth that you'd normally expect at this time in the background, and even if there's something somewhat absent even in the clothing and face. And this was picked up very much by his critics at that time, and they didn't like it. But anyway, that's Manet. And that's roughly 1865 or something like that, okay? In France. Now we're going to Cézanne. We're about 20 years later. I'm skipping a lot. I skipped the Impressionists. We all know about them. We all know that the Impressionists brought flatness back in, but they had such beautiful color, and we didn't miss the distance that would normally be involved in the third dimension. We didn't miss it because of the beautiful colors. But here's Cézanne with another portrait, and you can see it has gone further toward the loss of depth. There's much less of the depth of the face and the mustache and so on, and you can begin to sense that this is going to become a picture that's maybe more like a conceptual, schematic portrayal of a face. Next. As we move from Cézanne, we can see this even more striking change in the faces. This is a famous Picasso, the Ladies of Avignon. And you can see the faces are moving very much more toward, they're really schematic objects. There are no longer any serious amounts of shading for depth and so on and so forth. It's the beginning of what was then called Cubism. Most of us are familiar with this painting. The Ladies of Avignon were the night ladies, but we'll leave that aside. And we go on to the next drawing, which is called The Green Stripe. It's by Matisse. It was about the same time, in the early 20th century. We've moved from Impressionism, which I haven't shown, but from Cézanne and his paintings, which were at the end of the 19th century. We've now moved into the 20th century. We're about 1905, something like that. And this is called The Green Stripe, but you can see how the depth is again going away, and how this is really, in my judgment, would be a high level schematic face. It's very attractive because of the colors, of course. I don't know what his wife thought, because that's who that's who's portrayed here. But anyway, Matisse then moves very, very decisively to the schematic level. This is on the border between 3D realism, level 4, and level 3, because it's beginning to show mostly schematic qualities. And depth is almost gone. But now we go to the next level of almost entirely schematic representation. Next slide.
Next slide, please.
Okay, these are both Matisse. This is a schematic called Blue Nude, and the Blue Nude series went on for a long way. There were a lot of different expressions of it, but most of them were of this type. But here we see something that's purely conceptual in the sense of, the schematic concept is present, and nothing, very little real emphasis on depth at all. So that's pure level 3. Here is level 3 also. You can look at it, but it's very much reduced to the point where you're not quite sure that it's a human form. But then you look at the top and you say, oh, yes, that is. But what you are now is at the bottom of level 3. You're getting very close to just a geometric pattern being present. Next slide. Somewhat on average, a few years later, we now see a move completely to level 2. On the left, we have Delaunay, a French painter whose work was, you can see it's entirely geometric shapes. Over here, we have a famous Russian painter, Kandinsky, who also moved that way. Kandinsky, in his early drawings, did things that were moderately realistic and certainly very dramatically schematic. He did them with nice colors, and very, very important that way. But he then continued his regression in the service of the ego, and he comes up now with paintings later in his career of completely geometric patterns. Next slide, please. This is actually an early Mondrian. Most people wouldn't recognize it as Mondrian, but Mondrian, just like Kandinsky, in his first paintings, in his early work, they were relatively realistic. He did an even more realistic one of this, which was called The Tree. And this is, it looks something like a tree here, but you can see he's already broken it down almost to the geometric level. But this is still a schematic object if you recognize it as a tree, particularly if you could look at over here to the left, which there isn't any place to look at. He did some beautiful examples of this same tree that were more fully tree-like, if you will, but they were still conceptual level trees. But we're going to see now Mondrian will move to the complete geometric level, even simpler than the ones that we've just seen. Next slide. So here we have the typical Mondrian on the left. Vertical, horizontal lines, basic primary colors. The one color that Mondrian didn't consider primary was green. And that's because in pigments, when you mix blue and yellow, you get green, so it can't be primary. So you'll never find, as far as I've been able to notice, you'll never find green in the Mondrians. But anyway, we see a perfectly geometric Mondrian here, all level 2. But of course, you can go below the geometric, can't you? Who do you think we have here? You know who it was. This is our first American painter. The scribble stage has arrived. This is Jackson Pollock. Okay, let's look at the next slide.
Next slide, please.
We thought I was kidding. An artist might just give you a scribble. These are both paintings, expensive. You can don't try to buy them. They're by Franz Klein, an American abstract expressionist who was a contemporary of Jackson Pollock and of the whole abstract expressionist movement. He was one of the main figures. Excuse me. But to call this a scribble stage doesn't seem unreasonable, does it? Of course, these are much larger than on a small piece of paper. These are rather large canvases, in fact. But those are the scribble stage that we finally have reached in the trajectory of modernism. The modernist movement has come, and we've seen it going down the same hierarchy that previously children would go up and recovering mentally disturbed people would go up. All right, so let's look at the next slide. This is Franz Klein. Well, even we're getting now to what I would call almost level 0. And we're at the lowest level in a certain sense. We'll go a little further. These are Rothko, a very well-known painter at that time. And they would be called color field paintings. And they're very attractive because of the colors. But of course, they're very simple. We're beneath the level of scribbles. We're almost down to level 0, where there's nothing but the plain surface. But his latter paintings, this is an early Rothko, in a much happier state of mind he was at that time. This is near the end of his life, shortly before he committed suicide. Very dark. color fields, if you want to call them color fields.
Hmm.
Next. Okay, you can get even more extreme than the Rothko. This is Yves Klein, a Frenchman, and this is sometimes called Klein blue. He painted all of his paintings in different sizes and shapes, but all one color blue. So there's not even a color field, a mixture of two colors or a little bit of the edge that would be found with the Rothko. And there's somebody whose actual work is even more extreme than this. And I want to talk to you about him, but you can't show him. There's no way he's as identifiable as that wall. Robert Irwin made what were called all white paintings, but they were called scrim pieces. And that's because what he did is he had, in a gallery, there would be, let's say, 4 walls in the gallery. You can make sure there were no windows, just 4 walls, and you'd walk in where your work would be presented. And on one of the walls, he would tack a piece of fabric called a scrim that was all white. And he'd tack it across the top, tack it along the bottom and on each side. And it was the same white as the other 3 walls that were painted white. So when people walked into the show, what did they see? They saw 4 bare walls. In other words, the artwork itself had disappeared for everyone to be able to see in any normal sense. A few people were cognoscenti, and they knew what Irwin was up to. They went around poking the walls. And finally, they found one wall where the scrim piece had been established, and it was about 3 inches off the regular wall. They said, aha, we found you out. But this is where the painting has been reduced entirely to level 0. But I don't call that a real level of an image because there's not even a scribble on it. And that's what exists in here, in between these two. Even more extreme, believe it or not, you can get more extreme in the trajectory of going from 4D realism, 3D realism at stage 4 down. You can get even more extreme than an all-white canvas or a canvas that you can't even tell is the surface of the painting. And that came with something about 1970. And remember, these things are roughly in chronological order, roughly. And this was called conceptual art. In conceptual art, the artists, when I was at NYU, I even had one of them who were well-known conceptual artists in pursuit who came over and talked to us and so forth. But he said the problem with art is this. He says, you don't want there to be an object. You want only the concept. Art, the best art is a concept. And if you make it into a physical object, that's no. Because then people can buy and sell it and it gets corrupted by all of the things that people do with art. So he said the best art is a concept in your head. But then nobody could say who was a good artist or a bad artist or anything. You know, I could tell you, I'm really a great artist. I had this idea. I don't dare make it objectively visible because that would violate my aesthetic principles. But anyway, so the conceptual artist, the ideal conceptual artist was one who did not have to make the concept visible. But of course, they couldn't get by with that. So they did make objects that represented conceptual approaches to art. And this is one, and this is by Kossuth. And what it was a black square with, in white, the dictionary definition of the word document. He also had one that was exactly like this, except the word was idea. And he had the word spelled out in white print exactly as it came in the dictionary, mentioning its different significances and meanings. There are lots of conceptual artists, or were at the time, about 1970. And I would sort of say that conceptual art is the end of the modernist trajectory, where you've gone from 3D realism, which was just about dominant at the time of Manet. And as we've gone on, then less and less realism, less and less three-dimensional and schematic objects, Matisse, etc. and Picasso. And then we go down further into all geometric, Kandinsky, Delaunay, Mondrian, another one very low level in beyond conceptual into geometric is, I don't know if you know his name, Ed Reinhardt. He did sometimes what we call all black paintings. He made one mistake. He would leave a black square visible against an almost equally black background. So there was something to see there. It wasn't just the paint. But this was at the time often called minimal art. But what I'm trying to say is that the artist has now moved down to the geometric stage, or even further down to scribbles, or even further down to almost nothing at all when it comes to the plain surface. And that's the end of modernism, about 1970. It went out with a whimper. I don't think it's art critics and people who study it, they know all about it, of course, and write dissertations on the subject and so forth. But in 1970, what were you going to do if you were a young artist? You got to do something different, right? So what could you do that was different? Well, you had to go back to the image. And that's what postmodernist art was. They went back to the image. And now let's look at the next slide.
Next slide, please.
I propose that the first postmodernist artist was Andy Warhol. And he went back to the image, but in a different way than it had ever been done before. His famous Marilyn Monroe on the right, and his Campbell soup can on the left. And it was called pop art, and you can see why. But they're going back to the image, but they're going back to it with a different attitude. With Andy Warhol, the attitude was relatively positive and humorous, sort of fun. Hey, here's Marilyn Monroe. We've also, but look, I've just done her 4 times now, and with slightly different coloring in some of them. And isn't that great? And it was. They had given the image up entirely with conceptual art and with minimal art, and now we're back to it. But it's with a new attitude. It's the attitude that's going to change and make the difference in what we call postmodernism. Let's take a look at the next slide. Oh, here's along with Andy Warhol, at the same time, early postmodern would be Roy Lichtenstein. And so what he did is he took comic strip images and made them large as canvases. And they're also kind of fun. The attitude is still rather pleasant and rather fun. But what's going to change more and more in postmodernism is the attitude is going to move from being sort of fun and having a good time with the work. It's going to change to increasingly a criticism of art. I would like to call postmodernism primarily a kind of paint the mustache on Mona Lisa, which was actually a painting by somebody that we'll get to shortly. But one of the perhaps the most famous American postmodern artist is an artist named Jeff Koons. And here we see, this is called the Balloon Lady. Those are balloons or implicitly balloons, but it's a large sculpture. But it's certainly not a celebration of feminine beauty or beauty in any way. It's a kind of satire. Let's look at some more postmodernism.
Next slide.
This is another Jeff Koons, and this is called the Balloon Dog. Funny little nose right at the end. But again, it's a sculpture. Another postmodern sculptor who was kind of fun and different is Oldenburg. And Oldenburg did this sculpture here. It's called The Plug. I wonder why. But again, we're back to realism, 3 dimensions in the object, but it's with this strange, slightly critical, slightly distancing, and ironic attitude. Next slide. Here's another Oldenburg. That's a typewriter eraser. You remember them?
Yeah,
It's huge. Well, Oldenburg also did one was a big lipstick, but 15 feet tall. So there's a kind of fun in it all. Today, if Oldenburg were alive and making these sculptures, he would make a cell phone, a 20-foot high cell phone, where everybody could go and worship. And on the right, though, we have a different attitude showing up in postmodernism than just humor or distance. This is probably the most famous of the postmodern artists is a British artist named Damien Hirst. And this is one of his works of art. Again, don't try to buy it. It's a huge ashtray. But what's he saying about art? Nothing very good, okay? Let's go to the next slide, please. This is another Damien Hirst. Hirst, one of the things he did, he would get a cow, cut it in half. Now, he did all this himself, the butchering and everything. He cut it in half, took the skin off of it. This was a cow, put half a cow in one of these glass boxes. Sometimes they were lined with aluminum, sometimes with white, like this, white metal. And in that, he put the half a cow in that glass box, filled it up with clear formaldehyde to preserve it. Took the other half, did the same thing with it, but put it in a different box next to it. And then he took a calf, a baby cow, cut it in half, put it in a smaller box right behind this other one, and behind the other half as well, and called it mother and child. This one is the head of a cow that's been skinned, and it was one of 12, all in the same kind of box, and they were called the disciples. Also another postmodern artist, but this is not Damien Hirst. This is a picture, a postmodern painting of the Virgin Mary, in which elephant dung was also used. And this became rather well known as a kind of mocking of whatever might have been considered saintly and important. As was done here by calling this the disciples, one of 12 being called the disciples. This one is actually called, and I think it's something in the Arab, it's called St. Paul or just Paul. And he's not one of the 12, so I'm sure whether he was correctly called. By the way, Damien Hirst graduated from Catholic high school in London. And this was by an African artist, postmodern. It was the Virgin Mary. Not a very, it's certainly level 3 schematic object, recognizable. And then, as I said, elephant dung, she was flailed as well. Next slide. Here are two other postmodern works. This one, you can't see it very well. It's a crucifix. It's in a container with clear glass sides. It's a crucifix, and the yellow is urine. It's called Piss Christ. And that's a clear and important postmodernist work. And it was the urine of the artist. So this is a different aspect of postmodernism, but one that was given a great deal of attention, actually. On the far right, we have one of the last works by Damien Hirst. It's a skull, and it's covered with diamonds. And when it was sold for, I think, 50 million pounds, it was considered the most expensive work of art ever bought by a living artist. But it's a skull covered with the diamonds, presumably gave it its worth. I don't know. Next slide.
Next slide.
Okay. All of this is the postmodern world, as far as I'm concerned, ended roughly again with the whimper, probably around the year 2000, 2005, something like that. This kind of mocking of art, this kind of mocking of things we value, this kind of distancing yourself, even if it's done in a little bit of a fun way, that may still continue maybe, but the negative knocking of art by painting the mustache on Mona Lisa is, I think, has peaked and has started, after all, Damien Hirst is he's about 70 now. So, the young artist is looking for something new. We'll get to that in a short time. But what was going on all along in the art world anyway? I'm going to only focus here on American art, but America has long had a very powerful tradition of three-dimensional realism. And we'll go back now to the start of modernism. We're back around 1900. And here is the artist here, his name is Tanner. He's an African-American artist, not well enough known, but he's getting more and more known today. He does wonderful stuff. And this is one of them here, a couple praying at lunch or at dinner. And in 1900, when the world was going toward Cubism in France, he's painting in America something very realistic and very significant. And here's another painting by Tanner. It's a famous one. It's called The Annunciation. He was a very devout Christian, a Protestant, and I've noticed this particular image of the Annunciation, which is so wonderful, which he painted later after that, maybe some years after this one you see on the left. I've even seen it in a Catholic calendar. So I don't think anybody's paying any attention. He was a very devout Protestant, and obviously a very that's a masterpiece of a painting, as well as what's painted. His name was H.O. Tanner. Next slide. So this is going on in the American tradition. Of course, these are well known now, American realists, and I'm going to pick up. This is Homer, or Hopper. Okay. He was painting these paintings in the same time period that abstract expressionism was around, and people were moving on that modernist trajectory toward uncovering the next level of the image. He's continuing with realism, plenty of three-dimensionality in this. These are very well-known paintings now. Hopper painted until into the 1960s. This is another Hopper of a different type, but shows you that American realism, along with that of our friend Tanner, is alive and well. Next slide. Another American realist that most of you probably have heard of, Andrew Wyatt. These are two of his famous paintings. So here, everybody is going gaga in the art world again over modernist art, going toward abstraction and minimalism and minimal art. But here's Wyatt, beautiful realistic paintings. And this one is, you're almost supposed to think that the curtain is really out in the third dimension toward you, and the wind is coming in from the sea, which it was when he was painting. So these are famous Wyatts, Andrew Wyatt. His father, N.C. Wyatt, is a well-known illustrator, and he had a son named Jamie Wyatt, who's continued the realist tradition. Next slide. Here's another American realist painter who was going against the grain of what was going on in modernism. Another African-American artist. His name is Hendricks. And look, so he's not paying any attention to what's going on in that world of minimalism or postmodern negativity. And this was done, this beautiful portrait was done in 1970, at the very moment, at the very time that the Irwin scrim piece, which was all white, and you couldn't even notice it was there, was being shown. So he's holding on to the American tradition of realism. And they've done a beautiful job of maintaining it. And these are two of his paintings. That was done in 1970. This one was done, I think, in 1980 something. So he was continuing the realist tradition. Okay, next slide. Now we're back to today. Postmodernism is I think over. I don't know that anybody has held a public funeral. It might be more now to do it. We can take the crucifix out of this Christ and put it back where it belongs. We can do all sorts of, we can bring another one of the Virgin Mary, which is beautiful again. But we don't have to do just religious realism. Realism is back in a big way. And what this means is that the transcendental virtues of that, and those are beauty, goodness, and truth. And there's nothing better than to be more optimistic about than to think that beauty, goodness, and truth are now things for artists to devote themselves to in a way that it won't be an issue as to being out of fashion with the modernist trajectory and what have you. Some people may continue to do abstract works, let them. But the main thing is the new important artists that are coming today are realists. And they're focusing on goodness and truth and beauty. And I think here are just these, I'm not mentioning the artists here. We're just going to look at some examples that I found by chance in my own personal meanderings. Realism. I mean, they're still different. They're interesting, they're different, but you sense in them beauty, you sense that they're truthful, that is, they're telling the truth about some reality, and that they're good, that what their message is good. And the next slide. Here's another example of contemporary realism. It's beautiful, it's good, it's truthful, what's being shown you, what's real. So real it looks almost like you could bite one of those cherries. I wonder what kind of wine. Here's another realist painting, also very contemporary, showing what's going on now. Do we have any more images? Or are these the last?
Next slide.
Oh, yes, two more realists today. Not again, very interesting, different, not some sort of standard realistic. The images are realistic and three-dimensional, but they're very different and new and interesting. And this is the last slide. Okay. Thank you. So we should be optimistic. We're out of the postmodern, we're out of modernist, that's been completed. We're out of the postmodern period. We're now being able to go back and very realistically approach beauty, goodness, and truth. And it was maintained all along by very important artists. I mentioned two that are not well known, but should be. One is Hendricks. He recently died, but he was a Black American artist with real stature. Of course, also Tanner. Any questions now? Must have left a few gaps here and there. You know that covered a lot of our history, 170 years or so.
Why don't we take questions from the room first, and then we do have some online questions that you can respond to. Would you like to sit for this part of the? Would you like to remain standing? We'll adjust our camera.
These are online questions.
Those are from the online people. Yeah.
10 of them.
So far. So far.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? We'd be welcome to.
I have one. Are there any artists today that actually sort of acknowledge some of what you've kind of gone through?
I would think, I would assume so. they knew those who were traditionalists and painters were quite aware of how they were being socially ostracized. And the galleries wouldn't pick them up, they'd try to sell them a little bit. And then after a long time, maybe good realists, maybe Hopper or maybe Andrew Wyatt, got famous. Hendricks got relatively well known. By the time he died, he was a well-known artist. But they knew they were opposed to this minimal abstract stuff, which is an interesting thing. But to me, the most important thing about it was one, that it showed the regression in the development of the image, which was in this case in the service of the ego. So it was interesting, even though it didn't represent in any obvious sense beauty, truth, or goodness. But it did have some of that left, beauty and truth and goodness, as long as it stayed at the schematic level. Matisse is almost, a lot of Matisse is at the level 3, but it's often very beautiful. But once they started going into pure geometry, it's okay, but we're a little bit boring. And then you get to scribbles. Maybe you may want to give it some thought, but I'm not very big. I mean, Jackson Pollock tried to buy it, of course, but you know. So that's interesting in that way, but it hasn't maintained the 3 transcendentals of goodness, beauty, and truth. And these artists are aware of that, I'm sure, who are continuing to not a lot of black along the way. Any other question here? Yeah.
So elsewhere you've argued about how secularism here is in the 21st century. Is that trend related to what you're observing here with the postmodern moment, now moving to a new cultural moment where the transcendentals are less in part? So is that related, or is that totally different?
And Dr. Vitz, can I invite you to repeat the question?
The question, as I understand it, is modern psychology in any way, particularly the last, say, 20 years of psychology, in any way in sync with what's been happening in painting, which is moving back toward the transcendentals?
Yes.
I would say this is a hypothesis. I would say yes. And the answer to that would be, the evidence would be the fact that psychology has moved back to allow religion to be part of it. It's moved back to understand the importance of the virtues themselves. Seligman's work on the virtues has been a great contribution to psychology, but the virtues are, 3 of them are the transcendentals, right? And he actually includes those in his work as something that should be part of what human flourishing is about. So I think the same openness to the and loss of contact with the sort of rigorous modernist rationalist understanding has disappeared in psychology as well, to be replaced by something that I'm much more optimistic about. I'm much more optimistic about the next 50 years of psychology than would be about the last 50 years. At least maybe not, let's say from the year 2000 back 50 years. From 2000, modern psychology or contemporary psychology was, I think, moved in a way that's in sync with the art world capturing again these higher values. Good question. It's a hypothesis that I'm calling, and this is in sync.
So as the art and the postmodernism that you say is over, is that a predictor of what's going to happen to the general culture later, or does it follow?
Well, here I'll make another hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly.
Another hypothesis, which is much more optimistic than the fact that it's quite possible that the art world here is in advance of the general culture. You saw examples in the last slides of beautiful works. Beauty has been, and not only that, the pictures of females, particularly I thought of the one on the right, relatively, I guess she was African American, I'm not sure. It was really not just beautiful, it was exhilarating in the sense you recognize the person as good and truthful at the same time. And that was in the work. We don't have that in our culture at large. But maybe slowly the culture will line up with art pushing it from one side to the better and psychology from the other side. So we could then have, in spite of all of our current misgivings, doubts, and worries, something really positive coming up along in the future for the culture at large. Okay, now I guess I get to these things. Oh, two more questions.
A few more questions, yes.
You've spoken a number of times about the regression being at the service of the ego. I kind of have two parts. One, if you could expound on that. But second, it seems to me like if we take this as a movement, perhaps this very process of regression is at the service of the current ego return to realism.
Yes.
And I wonder if that's part of your hypothesis as well.
What we saw was regression and creation of an image, which was in the service of the ego in the case of modernism. But even the existing, there is the proposal that I'm going to argue for, the hypothesis, that regression in the service of the ego is the essence of creativity of any kind. And that all the modernists, the contemporary painters are painting something beautiful and realistic. They didn't get that idea easily. Even the realist has to regress to realistic images and experiences or understandings in their own past, visions they've had, people they've seen and known. They have to go into their unconscious, find something new and interesting, bring it back up to consciousness, and therefore bring it back into the service of the ego and their artistic talent and their skills. And I think that's to be done whether you're in any one of these artist traditions. If you're a novelist, even, you have to regress in some way to maybe to your own understanding of family life when you were growing up and people and those kind of ways, and then bring it up and put it in the modern world using your talent. But you can't, an artist who I think, I don't want to be too mean, but an artist that I don't think is very creative is, I don't know his name, but you've seen him on TV, the one who showed you how to paint a mountain, the big paper. You know who I'm talking about. And it's clear there's great talent there and great ability, but the images are all, so that person has talent, but can't regress to get something interesting to paint. You can't regress into your own experience to get something that's interesting. Because all he does is paint ways that we're all familiar with in a very quick way. So that's art without the regression. That's art just with the ego. Regression and service. Yes.
So you've gone through modernism and postmodernism. What would you name the new period?
The new period?
You say we're past.
Well, we're past those.
Pardon?
Yeah, all right. Let's say we're past them. Reality. We're back to something that's real, something that's beautiful and real, good and real, and truthful and real. Our culture at large is not there yet. But I guess that's what I call it. If you can think of something better, more than
It's not to put it on your book.
What about neo-realism?
neo-reality,
Neo-realism?
neo-realism, neo-reality, we could call it neos, and that makes it sound, So neo then after a while becomes, gold, so anyway, I say neo-realism, yes. That's still better than this realism. Let me see what's coming in the chat box. Okay, is it better for a child to learn to draw before they learn to paint, to print something like the alphabet? Also, does their development of learning to print letters follow the same stages? Well, letters, first of all, they can begin to paint before they know letters, and know anything about reading type for text. Most children can begin painting scribble stage, right? I mean, age 2 easily, or earlier. And then by age 3, then most of them are into schematic objects. You recognize, oh, that's you, Dad, or whatever. They're drawing somebody, usually by then. And so it starts earlier. And so I don't think they come at the same time. And for that reason, that it would be normal for them to learn to make images before they make letters. And of course, to make a letter, you've already got to get that past basic over the basic scribble stage to make letters. You've got to get at least into the geometric stage to be able to make the letter. And so that's why I think it's probably better to have them learn to draw first, then images first, and then it'll set them up to be able to make print letters. And then they can do them side by side. You saw one of them was a picture of some like a girl with a long dress, and above it said Emily. Emily was printed. So I think they can do both of them. Once they've gone past the geometric level, they can do both. And other than that, as to whether they should be separated or how to treat them differently or not, I don't know. Two, do you think there are stages in the appreciation of art as opposed to producing it? Yes, but I don't know what they are. I would, people who've had a lot of experience of developing an aesthetic appreciation of anything, it's clearly that people grow in their appreciation. So there must be, in a sense, certain stages of growth, focus, and so on. But what they might be, how to approach that, I think people who've experienced trying to teach the appreciation of art know much more about that than I do. So I pass. Nice dissertation. Oh, any materials you recommend for a non-specialist adult to start appreciating art, and especially the most recent? Well, you want to appreciate art, I told you have to find the person who's been teaching people how to appreciate art. And one of the ways is to talk about what is typical of different art movements. But then I gave a very large scale representation of art movements. I didn't go into minimal art and humanist art and all sorts of, the folk and all of the different local names for the different forms of modernism as it developed. That might be helpful for teaching people how to appreciate art, but I'm not so sure. I just don't know enough about how to teach people to appreciate art and to give you good advice of where to go to find how to do it. Except to find somebody who's done it and see what they say. Or can an individual's emotional mood cause them to regress in their artwork? Also, is it possible that individuals are using art to communicate a memory? Well, yes, and yes. Emotional the emotional mood can be part of your regression. Sometimes people regress under depression, or even possibly under anxiety. And it might help you to, if you wanted to regress, as long as you can come back. You don't want to be regressing just because, and not being able to come back. You don't want to regress and not come back to the consciousness. It can affect you having a mood, I think, as to whether you are able to regress. When people get depressed, they're usually thinking about something in the past, and worrying about how it might affect them in the present. So what is that? Maybe you can paint it. I'll give you some funny examples. There's something in psychology called a screen memory. It was first described and put in the psychological literature by Sigmund Freud. A screen memory is an early memory that screens or covers a trauma. So it isn't the trauma itself usually, it's something that covers the trauma. Okay. In the class, when I described this, I've asked the class, each member of the class, do you have an early memory? Not the earliest necessarily, but an early memory that somehow or other has kept reoccurring. You have it this time, you have it over and over again or something. If you have it, it's a memory, it's not a dream, and it's not necessarily the first memory, but it will be an early memory. Write it down on a piece of paper. I collect, or we talk about what the screen memory is. 1 out of 3, this is the proportion of scoring I found for. 1 out of 3 of the screens is a screen covering an attachment anxiety situation. The actual screen, when I asked them what I was on the beach and I lost where my parents were, and suddenly there were strangers around me and they picked me up and they found my parents. Or here were 2 students in a class who were both artists. And I asked them what was their screen, if they had a screen memory. One of them came up afterwards. He said, yeah, he said, I said, what are you doing? And I'm painting fishes. Lots of colorful fishes that I'm painting. What's your earliest screen memory? He said, well, my earliest memory is I'm in the back of the car with my mother and father are arguing with each other and having a fight. And it wasn't a short time later that my father left and my parents got a divorce. Or you see the attachment anxiety situation, right? And I said, what does that have to do with fish? He said, I don't know. We had just left the Boston Aquarium where the argument had occurred. Start. Another one. I'm talking about how maybe that screen memory, that's the question about when the memory. Here's another screen memory. The student, who's also a graduate student and artist, drew a picture, a square, and then around it another square with lines in there, and he says that with a baby in the middle of it. And he says that baby's me. My earliest memory is being in a crib with, the lines of the crib all around me and me looking out. And I remember looking out and seeing my father leaving and going to work. So we had a nice example of a separation, an attachment problem. His father leaving, and he said, yes, later my father left us all together. Later. And I said, all right, but what kind of art are you doing? He says, I'm a photographer. Oh, well, what are you doing? I'm taking pictures of New York City. And he said, and I'm taking all of the pictures through a grid. Just like the world looked at that kids and looking through the bars of that child contraption he was in. We saw that from the drawing. He made the drawing of the lines We were representing the vertical lines of the crib. Maybe something is a I'm taking all my pictures in that early stage, looking out at the world. I've come across other examples of this, but these are examples where two artists' early memories were both related to the attachment trauma, and yet were screening it, and yet now it so fascinated them that they felt they had to draw a paint about it, or draw a photograph, or draw. Does that answer your question? I could give you another example of a famous woman's sculpture who did the same, who had the same kind of early childhood memory of attachment fear, attachment loss. And how her sculpture, which made her famous, it was a recreation of her earliest attachment, her earliest screen memory. Next. Were Matisse and Picasso reflecting and expressing some regression of Western civilization? Can such regression be picked up on a subconscious level by artists who do not fully understand what they are expressing? That is it not only personal, but also a wider level of understanding? I don't know. It would be very interesting if you could point out at the core of Western tradition at that time in France and in other artists here, even in the US, up to about 1950 or 70, if there was something regressive going on in the world that they were picking up on. I don't know. It would be a fascinating concept to identify, but I don't know. Have you anything to say about Lascaux and other prehistoric sites? Many modern researchers are saying that these drawings and caves are in a way coded. The way in which they're coded, I don't know enough about the answer. I do know they're trying to do this. But I also know that the cave drawings, the first drawings that were there, were not those nice animals that were so exciting and attractive. Those were the last ones. The first ones were basic scribbles. And then straight lines or, patterns that were clearly not made by animals. Animals do not naturally make works of art. You don't naturally paint. When they do occasionally be given a flat surface, they will do a few scribbles. But that's all you can do when you move something that's not really interesting. But other than that, I don't know whether there's a sequence of development of the kind that you see in children's drawings that you could find if you could historically date the existence of a particular examples in caves. There is some evidence that the development of art in the Greco-Roman tradition began with simple scribbles and then basic geometric designs, and finally turned into schematic objects, and finally turned into realism. The latest stages of Greek and Roman art were heavily realistic. Then there was a cultural collapse, and the next best period of art was back to schematics. Anyway, these are interesting possibilities. I leave them for you to have fun with, or think about, or tosses. They should go in the waste paper basket. The aesthetics of Gilson, Maritain, and Hildebrand are quite different. Whose view do you most subscribe to? I don't know. I know they're aesthetics, but I'm talking about something psychological in the construction of an image. I'm not judging whether something is good aesthetically or not. I do think that as long as they're dealing, the work has to deal with at least schematic objects, recognizable objects, schematic, or realism, to be really, really aesthetic. But I don't think most of those theories dealt with that issue. Architecture is the queen of the arts. but many consider modern buildings ugly and regressive. Would you provide a comment on that? Yes. Well, look, a lot of the worst of modernism in art, you couldn't get down to art. You had to have something physical. You couldn't be an architect who believed in conceptual art. And conceptual architecture would be non-physical. And you couldn't make it just a simple plane, but you could come close to it. So with modern art, a lot of it is close to either geometric patterns. You can see a lot of Mondrian in modern art. And you can see a lot of the very plain, minimal art shows a lot of kind of modern art that now we call Motel modern. And that kind of modern art is not very attractive as art. It has lost all decorative characteristics. It has lost a lot of the functionality. And for example, it made every room equal to every other room. That was one of their principles. We didn't design in their architecture. A kitchen is distinct from a drawing room, is distinct from a library, is distinct from the bedroom. They came down with just one, they came down to a minimal notion of what a room should be. So there were similarities between minimalism and modern art, and ugliness and regression in the modernist tradition. So there are traditions. And I would say this, architecture is also now going into a neo-realistic movement. For about the last 20 years, those really ugly modern things anyway, they're all over Europe too. They're not being built anymore. And when you have a really good architect now, they're often into beauty. So I think we're seeing something relatively similar in the world of architecture. So the queen of the arts is also shaped up. Do I attribute any meaning to someone like Warhol or Salvador Dali, who run the gamut from lesser art, like Worrell's Campbell Soup Can, to religious art? I don't know how to compare them. I have trouble with surrealist art, like Salvador Dali. He's very three-dimensional, but he's not very realist. He makes unreal configurations with a lot of three-dimensionality. Same with Madrid. But I have trouble with surrealist art fixing behavior. I don't think it fits in my sequence. I think it has to be treated separately. And how to treat it in any way that would relate to what I'm talking about, I don't know. Other than seeing any connection between Salvador Dali and Andy Warhol, no, I don't see anything. But I'm open to evidence if you have it. Question 10. Okay. Rothko also did a Stations of the Cross, a combination of spiritual themes, but very low on your scale. What do you make of that? You can have a very minimal cross. And you could have all Stations of the Cross slightly different, without much state. I mean, that meant you were showing a picture. Rothko would not show a picture of Jesus in his work. You can have a very minimal. I'll give you an example. You can do that. I don't think it's the best way to do it, because I don't think it communicates the essence of the Stations as effectively to most people. But you could do it in a way that would be effective for certain kinds of people. There was an artist called Ad Reinhardt, and he did paintings that were black on black. But what I meant by black on black, it wasn't all black of one color. It would be a black square on top of a slightly less black background. But he also did some Christian paintings. He did a black cross 4 black squares that formed by the same color and formed a cross on a slightly different black background. So it was minimal. It was a minimal cross. That's the kind of thing I can imagine Rothko doing or something like that. Otherwise, he might not even put a cross in his. I don't know that word. But Rothko did do some of his paintings for a Buddhist church, Buddhist ceremony, or environment, and they were very dark and what you call color screen paintings. Okay, very dark, not as black as the last ones he did before he committed suicide. They were more gray and so on, and those would be likely to suggest meditative Buddhist states. That would be okay and make sense. How he would do the Stations of the Cross for a Christian, I don't know, but he might have done them like Ad Reinhardt did, where there was the hint of the cross in a minimal way that would be possible for a person to meditate on in a way that would be truly Christian and spiritual. But it seems to me to be minimal, and only certain kinds of people could respond in an adequate way. That's all.
We do have a final question from Dr. Scrofani for you, number 1 here.
Oh. Hi, Dr. Scrofani. We don't have a question from Dr. Scrofani. We have 3. 1. We have art in the caves of France going back over 20,000 years that seem to have achieved the realism we are rediscovering today. In fact, these sketches are considered evidence of the beginning of higher cognitive thought. Are we catching up to the past? I would say yes, in a certain sense. I would argue that historically there have been times when art has moved from the beginning of the culture that was just starting. And we're working within that culture now, within that tradition, not outside of it, within it. And it has moved from simple stick figures or even geometrics or scribbles up to realism and stopped. And I would be happy to see somebody, as I mentioned earlier, who could date all the different images in those caves and the different caves, so we could see possibly what the caves had drawn on them 20,000, let's say 30,000 years ago, then 28,000 years ago, then 25,000 years ago, then 20,000, and see if there were in those cave drawings evidence of such a progression. And then in every cave that had any change in the images, if there was that same kind of progression. Maybe from stage 1 to stage 2, maybe stage 2 to 3, maybe just 3 to 4. But the realism of the caves in France is pretty good, but it is not as detailed in depth as modern paintings are. You see the shading on the individual animals, but there's not really a complete 3D representation. We don't know why. Now, how was that related to the human cognition? I think the caves are the sign that I think human beings came into existence about 40,000 years ago. And they came into existence when human consciousness first occurred. And what happened when consciousness first occurred, they also had the ability, that's when they began human language. Human language would not be picked up when it was first being developed. We had no tape recorders to do that. But the first sign of the human consciousness would be human drawings. And the fact that we don't have drawings prior than, say, 30,000 years ago, maybe, there's some debate as to whether certain scribbles are drawn, animals or not. But let's say the earliest scribbles, the earliest human things that we know that are drawings are maybe 30,000 years ago. I think that's when human consciousness first arose, and with it human language at the same time. That's when death arose. That's when death first occurred. Animals don't know there's death. We know it. What we mean by saying death first occurred was when the knowledge of death first occurred. There's no reason to think, very young infants don't know there's death. Not until language is introduced. So I think that's when the human consciousness began and when the first human beings began. They were the first ones, and it might have been an Adam and an Eve. I don't know, it was a small tribe, probably the guess is probably in North Africa. That first had human consciousness, and therefore, but then it spread quickly, very quickly among all the primates who were capable of it once it was could be taught or listened to or heard. But somebody had to think of it or have the experience of human consciousness without somebody telling them about it. Without somebody talking to them yet. Nobody was talking at all. And somebody had to first discover they could start talking and people could develop. And I expect it had to do with the interaction between two very bright primates that suddenly bang, time, death, past, future, love, all sorts of things suddenly came into existence with it. The way you can find out what it was like is read the story of Helen Keller coming to human consciousness. And I think that happened in time with some very smart primate. Let's say a pair, Adam and Eve. That's my guess. So over and over again, then we would get human consciousness, we would get the repeating of the stages of development when you start at a low level up through to realism. Do you know if art word predates words? I'm arguing that art word is the first expression that words have occurred. Human language has occurred. Human consciousness has occurred, and the first expression probably in words, and then very quickly afterwards in the drawing. What can you say about the dynamics and statics in the painting you discussed? Nothing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guest.
Great, Wes. This is the first time I've ever presented this material, so I'm sure it was done in wacky. I hope that the basic ideas that an image can be thought of as constructed through 4 stages. At the 0 level is that all blank canvas. We can regress up and down it as a function of developing as children or developing as artists. We develop up it, we can go down it in a regressive stage due to mental problems. We can sometimes recover from them and go back up. And that the best kind of art is at least at realism or at conceptual art, schematic art, where you can recognize shape in objects such as the and that the minimal art of geometry and scribbles, you can get something out of it at any point. Compared to the other, because you've lost realism and lost the most important searches for beauty. The beauty truth of it is the most, in my judgment, the most wonderfully expressed in paintings of the human being. And in some things of the natural world. So you lose that when you go down to scribbles, you go down to the
I do invite us to continue our conversation over refreshments, which await us to the side of the room. This does conclude our lecture. Thank you.